And Shoshana, I sent you a PDF of the sources that we'll look at. The beginning, we won't have sources, and then we will look at a few texts together. I don't know if there's a way to email it to folks here. Otherwise, we will have it in front of us in the Zoom. But in
Okay.
case you wanted to have them locally on your drive, or yeah, if you just want to have it for afterwards, that's also
Yeah, I
totally
think we'll do
fine.
it afterwards.
Okay.
All right, well, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many faces on this lovely Zoom screen. Takes me back to when we were doing a lot of these, but it's really nice to have our guest tonight. And I'm trying to edit his bio, but there's so many fascinating things that you've done that I don't want to leave too many of them out, but I also want to leave plenty of time for you
Leave
to
more out than you
use
plan.
more. Um, Rabbi Dr. J. Michaelson is a political commentator, a rabbi, and the author of 9 books, including the best-selling God versus Gay, The Religious Case for Equality.
Oh
He
yeah,
holds a
that was a great
JD
book.
from Yale Law School and a PhD from Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Jay is a commentator on CNN and a columnist at Rolling Stone, having been the legal affairs columnist for the Daily Beast for 8 years. Dr. Michaelson is an affiliated assistant professor at Chicago Theological Seminary and a visiting scholar at the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion. His most recent book, The Heresy of Jacob Frank, From Jewish Antinomianism to Esoteric Myth, won the 2022 National Jewish Book Award for Scholarship. Michaelson is also a non-denominational rabbi who has taught meditation for 20 years at corporations, Buddhist retreat centers, and synagogues. He lives outside of New York City with his husband and daughter. And welcome, Jay. It's very nice to have you here tonight.
Thank you, Shoshana, and thanks everybody. And for those who just joined, it is a kind of a nice virtual return to New Haven. I do really look fondly back on my years there, so it's nice to connect and nice to see so many of you. Yeah, and it is. We were talking before. Most of you came in. It's nice to sort of change the subject from what's on a lot of our minds and hearts, obviously, at least somewhat change the subject, and but I also want to hold that reality in mind as well, since of course it's with us. So I am very into this session because it's funny. Many years ago I wrote that book, God versus Gay, and there's a question mark in the title, God versus Gay, question mark. And the basic argument of that book was that it's not about like reconciling inclusion with religion, but actually seeing how the core values of our religious traditions upholds and encourages not just inclusion but celebration and diversity and the full humanity of, at that point it was the LGB part of the LGBTQ plus spectrum. And it's, that book was written because it felt like there was that polarity for those of us. I think most of us were old enough to remember like the marriage battles in the late 2000s and the 2010s. You would often see in the media a well-meaning, secular human rights activist, civil rights activist doing the sort of pro-LGBTQ side, and then somebody religious identified, one way or the other, doing the anti. And you really did get that message that it was God versus gay, that it was one or the other. And that was a moment in time, and I was really honored to play a very, very tiny role in some of the changes that took place at that time. I was working as a professional LGBTQ activist at that time, and it's what's I've seen happen in the last few years has been a sort of horrifying and more damaging repetition of that dichotomy. Um, there's sort of sometimes there's described like there's a backlash in our country around LGBTQ equality, but particularly for trans populations, there never was a frontlash. Like there's like the backlash without the initial thing that there's a backlash too. And I'm sure I won't spend a lot of time with this. I'm sure we're familiar, with the legion of laws across the country that are rolling back access to healthcare, that are making it harder to simply exist as a transgender person. And I'm seeing a similar kind of dynamic play itself out now as also played itself out 10 or 15 years ago. Around some of the gay and lesbian issues around marriage and non-discrimination and so on, which is, again, there are these kind of core religiously motivated beliefs that a lot of Americans have, probably like 80 to 100 million Americans have, like almost a third of the country. And they're behind a lot of the prejudice and the animus. And it's not like one is motivating the other. They feed one another. So there's the fear, the concern, the ignorance, and so forth. And then there's this sort of religious justification around it, or sometimes it's a pseudoscientific justification. But this session is not about, quote unquote, the other people, like those bigoted people way over there who have this is also about us. And I think that there's a real opportunity to embrace this aspect of what I would call the struggle for liberation and self-actualization as part of the affirmation of some core Jewish religious values. And that's true for all of us. And I think so what I'm going to do this evening is give a little bit of an introduction. There'll be like 10 more minutes of me speaking. And then we'll spend a lot of the time just digging into some text, some juicy text, a biblical text that's very familiar, and a couple of Kabbalistic texts that are probably very unfamiliar. And what's my overall kind of claim or, intention for this session? It's to show that while our categories of gender and transgender and gender nonconforming people and non-binary people, those categories are relatively new. And a lot, for folks who are encountering them, it can seem like they came out of nowhere and suddenly it's very fast, and you're supposed to be, making sure to never say the wrong thing or else you'll be canceled forever. And there can be a kind of a struggle around that. But what's not new is gender diversity as a phenomenon. That phenomenon is found not just in human civilization, but even in non-human animals as well. And it shows up in ways that we just need to look at carefully to see, right? So there is no biblical Hebrew word for transgender, right? And that just doesn't exist. But there are people in biblical text who don't conform with the gender expectations of their society, and who are celebrated for that. Who are not just like, they don't conform and that's bad, but there's something about their essential mission as human beings that is connected to how the sort of their gender understanding is different from the normative expectations of their society. And that's actually really beautiful, I think. And it's a different way of sort of seeing this phenomenon, the phenomenon of varieties of gender expressions that we are familiar with, that's different from like putting it into the box of like just what we ought to sort of do. And it's not that there's something wrong with that, but there's a richer way, I think, to approach this phenomenon of the human experience. That's kind of my overall overarching objective. I want to do just like a couple of sort of simple-ish definitions, although they're not so simple. And the more folks are familiar with them, the more you know that what I'm about to give over is like a very gross oversimplification. So generally speaking, we can distinguish, although they're interrelated, between something around biological sex and gender. And gender is all of the stuff that is in our minds, and it's also in our bodies, but it's not connected to, let's say, whether you have XX or XY chromosomes. It may or may not correlate with anatomy in a particular way, right? Sex is kind of connected to those things, but gender is the whole set of cultural constructions that surrounds that, right? That surrounds that reality. So just really simply, if you're in medieval Scotland, it's gender appropriate if you're identifying as a man to wear what would now look like a skirt, right? A kilt, right? And now fashions are changing again, and there are all kinds of interesting kind of skirt-like garments for men and non-binary people. But for most of the last couple of 100 years, that would be seen as gender transgressive or non-conforming for a man to wear a dress or to wear a skirt. Incidentally, my daughter here in school it's now very common for clothes that used to be reserved for one gender or the other now, so that's no longer really a marker of gender, but it might have been for a while. But of course, it goes deeper than that. Gender has to do with power. It has to do with our places in society, and it tends to until recently really kind of put folks into very specific boxes, and those boxes correlate with what their roles are meant to be in society and traditional societies. Again, how much power they have, and how they're meant to be, how they're meant to act in the world. So there is sort of this phenomenon that, you know, there's also not a clear Hebrew word prior to the contemporary period for gender. Sex and gender are mixed up. So for example, you may have heard that there's like 5 genders in the Talmud, and that's kind of true, and it's pretty interesting and exciting, and it's not what I'm planning to talk about, but I'm happy to talk about it. But then when you look at how those genders are defined, it's like a mix of sex and gender, right? So one of them has to do with physical anatomy. Somebody who has like the androgynous, that sounds like androgynous, right, is defined in the Talmud as somebody who has both male and female anatomy. Well, so is that sex or gender? And the answer is it's a mix. And that's how it is with all of these kinds of categories. Whenever we go back to the Bible with our categories, whether it's about race or ethnicity, or even the word religion, which is not an indigenously Jewish word, or sex and gender, we're coming from our categories and our terminology and our assumptions, and they sometimes do or don't match what's in the biblical material, the Talmudic material, the Kabbalistic material. So all this to say that I'm going to be a little bit having to mix these categories, but analytically understanding the kind of cultural construction of gender is really fundamental, I think, to understanding the whole kind of phenomenon. So I can make another parallel. Probably one story we're not going to look at is the story of David and Jonathan. So the story of David and Jonathan is this sort of same-sex love story. And, you know, it's maybe up to interpretation, like were they quote unquote doing it or not? And I'm not super interested in that question, right? What I am interested in is that there was a certain form or convention of male love, kind of warrior love, the hero and his sidekick. So like Batman and Robin kind of thing. And that was an understood form of social relationship, right? That's not about gender, but that's a socially constructed form of relationship that would have been legible, would have been readable and understandable by anyone in the medieval, well, I don't know, anyone in the Mediterranean period at that time, right? So Achilles and Patroclus, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, there are numerous examples of this form of relationship. And so that's sort of a parallel, right? So we might project back from our 21st century location and say, well, I guess David and Jonathan were gay. Or, well, I guess David at least was bisexual because he also had wives, which got him into some trouble. I don't know, is he gay or bisexual? Well, those are recent terms, right? The way to understand, I think the best way to understand the David and Jonathan relationship is that it was a male, probably physically consummated because it usually was, but it was a male hero sidekick kind of relationship that was a convention of warrior love in Mesopotamia, in Greece, and throughout the Mediterranean in the time. So that's a parallel of how it's perilous to ever take our categories and kind of project them back in. But if we don't do any analogy, then there's this real problem of invisibility, right? So now gender diversity does look really new, right? It's like, well, where is this? Like, if there were trans people all the time, where are they? I don't see them in the Bible. I don't see non-binary people in the Bible. So, but they are in the Bible. They're just not marked in that way. And they are in our sacred text, and they are in our tradition. And so it's not about like, oh, it's okay to be X or Y or Z because Jay found something in the Bible. It's about healing this false dichotomy between the lived reality of gender diversity on the one hand and a sort of rich engagement with religious text and tradition on the other hand. That was my intro spiel. Now would be a good time for me to pause. And if do we have the raise hand feature in this configuration of Zoom? So if somebody had a question just on that introduction, we could do that. Otherwise, we'll actually turn to text, which hopefully will like explain the abstractions that I've just talked about. All right, let's do it. Let me get to share screen here. Make sure the right PDF is up. Nobody wants to see the schmooze Zoom instructions that are also in my screen right now. All right, everybody seeing this this PDF? Great. So the first, it's saying now screen sharing. So now everyone should see it. This first text is very, very familiar. And the second stuff that we'll look at is very unfamiliar. So it'll be the familiar first, and then the really fun, interesting stuff later. So I think probably, I don't know what our levels of Jewish literacy are, but like the sort of story of Jacob and Esau is kind of a fundamental one. It's very, very kind of familiar to folks. So what I want to do is take a gendered lens to this story. Max Strassfeld, who's a brilliant transgender Jewish scholar, wrote a book called Trans Talmud. We're not going to look at the Talmudic material, at least not it's not printed out in this session, but Max's book is a great introduction to that. But they came up with the phrase transing, like queering, like transing the Bible. So like transing is looking at a text through a gendered lens that kind of, we have our gender hat on a little bit and see how gender is being constructed and played with and maybe even undermined. So because of the dynamics of Zoom, I think I'm going to read the text. If we're in person, I love when other people read, but just I'll start. This is the story. So we know the part that's not in here, right? The birth of Jacob and Esau. And this is yet another Jewish origin story in which kind of the younger, seemingly disfavored son is actually the chosen one, right? So one generation up, the same thing happened with Isaac and Ishmael, right? Ishmael was older, he was kind of making fun of Isaac, but Isaac is kind of the chosen one. It'll happen in this generation. So again, with Jacob and Esau, and then it'll even happen in the next generation with Joseph and his brothers. There's this recurring theme, which seems to probably match the Israelite experience of being a much smaller nation surrounded by bigger, stronger ones, right? There was really this understanding in the period in which the Bible was codified, in which this was all kind of written down, that we the Israelites / the Jews, we may not look like the big, strong, powerful ones, but we have this relationship with the divine, with God. That's speculation, but I think that's pretty common speculation. Okay, so this is where we know they birth, and like Esau comes out first. Jacob's like holding on to him, and all right. So the boys grew. Esau is described as a cunning hunter, a man of the field. Jacob was described here as Tom, right? He's an Ish Tom, which is not clear what that really means. And he dwells in tents. Okay, we'll get back to this in detail in a second. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his venison, and Rebekah loved Jacob. First of all, I kind of love this very superficial. Isaac doesn't come off too good in this whole story, right? It's like he likes his son because of the meat, right? Like that's the love of his eldest son. It's like, thanks for hunting all that. So already I want to suggest, we'll actually do one more verse. So this is this introduction. Things happen, right? Jacob has already tricked Esau out of the birthright, which he traded for a bowl of porridge. Esau came back, and Jacob was there cooking, and Esau was hungry, and Jacob kind of does this. It's not quite a trick, but certainly an unfavorable deal, trading the birthright for a bowl of porridge. And now Rebekah and Jacob are kind of scheming to also get the blessing, which should go by rights to the oldest son, to Esau, oldest only by a half a minute, but still older. And Rebekah and Jacob are scheming to get Jacob to give the blessing for Isaac to give the blessing to Jacob instead. So they're planning this thing out, and Isaac can't see so well, but Jacob is worried that Isaac will feel his skin and he'll know that it's not Esau. He says, "Behold, Esau, my brother, is a hairy man, but I'm a smooth man, and maybe my father will feel me, and he'll see that I'm mocking him, and I'll bring a curse onto myself, not a blessing." So, if we're taking a gendered lens to these 3 or 4 verses, is there anything that pops out from a perspective of gender, or like what's going on in these verses? And you can use raise the hand thing to speak. People are feeling passive learning is the way. I'll just keep talking if I need to.
I can't find the hand, but can I say something?
Yes, please.
It seems that Esau was more self-determined and decided whatever he was going to do whereas Jacob was looking for advice and wanted to collaborate and work with others.
That's interesting. I like that. So that's not where I was going, and I always like when the answer is not what I was fishing for. So, but it's actually really interesting. So I think that's great, right? So like Jacob, he's also, if we take he's like getting his mother's advice. He's kind of if we were to project back with anachronism, kind of the mama's boy a little bit, right? But more than that, dwelling in tents is really a clear demarcation of gender in this society, right? Women dwell in tents. In fact, they're not supposed to leave the tents, right? There's a passage later in this story where Leah, Jacob's wife, is described as going out from the tent, and that is seen as sexually aggressive, like it's seen as lascivious, as improper, as immodest, and Leah is acting like a man. Right. Obviously, this is a profoundly misogynistic and patriarchal set of constructions. I'm just giving it over. Right. So Esau is the man who's doing the man stuff. Right. And Jacob is in the wrong place. Right. He's a man out of place. He's in women's space. He's also, he's not a hunter, which is a sort of traditional thing that men should be doing, right? It's not really clear what his role is. I mean, he's cooking, which is also a role that's more women's role. He's even gendered, I would say, female in his in some aspects of his anatomy, right? So I'm smooth and Esau is hairy. Now, just quickly, I'm not really. I said I was mixing sex and gender. I'm not claiming that Jacob was actually, a woman or something like that. I'm saying that Jacob's gender is not conforming to the societal expectations of what a man is supposed to be, right? We might, from our perspective, obviously criticize a lot about that, right? First of all, there's a kind of essentialism that's here. There's also a gender binary, and there's also this sort of, association of femininity and masculinity with specific gender roles, which might be offensive to us today. And I welcome all of that offense. That being said, within the gender roles of this society, Jacob is not conforming. He's not conforming to them. And not only, it's not even just his skin, but even his voice, right? His voice is higher than Esau's. So he's continually kind of gendered in a way that is non-conforming with what masculinity is supposed to look like. So again, this doesn't mean Jacob's gay. It doesn't mean he's trans. It means that he's not. There's a kind of, there's a misfit or a non-conformity. I just keep repeating that word, between Jacob's enactment of his gender role and even his appearance, and what society expects of men in a biblical patriarchal society. I just kind of scroll down, right? And there's right. So he's right. He's associated with his mother. He's listening to his mother. He seems. I liked. Is it Eva or Ava? Eva. I loved Eva's point too. That it's not. It's funny. I like when I get to bring in some of my career work into another career. So I actually was on CNN last night and talking about the ridiculous thing that happened in Congress where these two men like almost started a fist fight on the floor of the Senate. Well, that's what men are supposed to do, right? Men are supposed to, right? And I loved Eva's idea that like Jacob's a little bit more collaborative. Like maybe he has a different kind of masculinity that isn't quite the toxic masculinity that we saw on the floor of the Senate yesterday. But certainly I think there's something really powerful about the mismatch between Jacob's sex, right? He's a son, he's male, and the way that he performs his gender roles in this little sliver of the story. Okay, this was in a way a sort of introduction, but I think it's really fascinating to look at numerous characters who bring forward a certain kind of gender nonconforming visibility that might otherwise be absent. So for example, the Ruth and Naomi story is sometimes, I think, I don't love the way it's sometimes read as like, oh, is this a lesbian story? Were they doing it? Right? What this is really a story to me about is women finding a space for freedom within the context of the patriarchy. And once again, not conforming to the gender expectations that they have, right? It's like, there's not supposed to be these independent women who are living on their own and making it work. Right? That's not what you're supposed to do as a woman in that culture. And yet that's the space that they carve out for themselves. Or if you look at warriors like Deborah and Yael, who again, warriors are, you see, once you start seeing this, you can't unsee it, right? Or back to sort of Joseph, the way that Joseph is described in very, scare quoting here, feminine terms. I'm scare quoting because I don't think that being beautiful is essentially feminine in any way. It's what it is. Everybody can be beautiful, but in this particular cultural context, he's described as beautiful in a sort of feminine way, right? And he has this kind of he wears his fancy colored coat and so forth. And there's a whole there's some wonderful writing in the contemporary kind of LGBTQ queer theology world about Joseph in particular. So, and we see this again and again in lots and lots of world traditions. So why is this, again, I'll just repeat before we go into the Kabbalah material, like why I find this empowering and enriching is that it shows that even in a society that's very distant from ours in terms of its traditional mores and its understanding of gender more narrowly, there's still space for the person who gives his name to the people of Israel to be identified in this gender nonconforming way, that this was part of human experience going back as far as there ever was human experience. And last thing I'll say on Jacob, obviously his formative experience where he really comes of age and changes his name, this traditional kind of initiation rite in a kind of Joseph Campbell way, right? He's wrestling with a man, right? He's wrestling, you could say, I don't think with too much, loosey-goosiness, wrestling with masculinity and trying to understand what kind of man he is or can be, because he's not going to be a man like Esau. He's going to be a different kind of masculinity, and that I find really empowering, even for as recently as yesterday's news. Before moving on to these weird Kabbalistic texts, I thought I'd pause again. And if the hand thing isn't working, you can just unmute and ask. I'm not too fixated on the hand.
I have like a question comment of that. It seems that what we're grappling with now and what we're referring to is somehow there needs, maybe it's just part of being human, but there needs to be this way to somehow name you and figure you out for our own comfort. And it seems with at least what I'm learning and recent renaming and awareness that I don't think that flies anymore. Like, I don't need to know that about you. You don't need to know that about me. So to me, like the subtext of all this, although it's not as simple as all, but the Acello Express subtext is like, you're human, I'm human. Okay, that's all I need to know. But it seems that there's a great deal of mishigas about trying to figure out, your pronouns, and not that I'm not saying I'm disrespecting that. I think that's very important, but there seems to be somehow we're caught up in needing to know.
Yeah, I love that last part. Thank you for that. Also, I'm now going to keep using the Acela Express version as a way of saying, the short version of something. Yeah, I mean, look, we're in a moment now where we're in some place of change, right? And so I think one way to create inclusive communities is that pronouns is one piece of that, just what language is another piece of that. But that's partly because we're in this moment of like wrestling. And, but I think your basic, like that point of like, there seems to be this frequent human urge to put us all in boxes. And if there's one thing that the recapturing of the word queer means by LGBTQ people, like queering means the misfit between the label and our reality, right? And the big lesson for me also from the Jewish stuff, and we're only looking at a couple of texts, is everybody is queer. Like none of us fit into these boxes in a perfect way, right? So we may be very comfortable in whatever gender box we're in, and that's great, that's lovely. But even then, there's just not the messy human reality is one that resists the sort of simplifying boxes. And certainly gender is one example of that, but there are others too, right? And in all kinds of different ways in which we're sort of categorized or typed or put into little Zoom boxes, epistemological Zoom boxes by society. And this is one of those. So I love that. And I think we'll even see that this transitioning to the second part, no pun intended, this is even true of the divine. Even the model of God is one that has within it a very confounding system of gender and gender typing. So probably folks know, I should have maybe brought the chart in for this, but this basic Kabbalistic doctrine of the Sefirot, the emanations of the divine. So we're flash forwarding almost 2,000 years from the biblical material to the Kabbalistic one. But the Kabbalah, one of the many things it's very interested in is the nature of divine multiplicity. So like the relationship of if everything is one, but God seems to really be acting in weird ways. And there are these 10 emanations, these 10 qualities, which are both human and the divine, according to this teaching. And they're gendered in ways that is incredibly confounding to any simple notion of the binary. So there are Sefirot that change their gender depending on their relationship with others. There are Sefirot that have both genders within them and neither. And even according, this is a summary by a scholar, Charles Mopsick, the source, the Sefirot are called masculine or feminine because they are each, as a function of gender, androgynous in a particular way. So there's a really radical concept of the divine as gender changing and meaning transcending the notion of gender. So I think a really simple example, it's understood that the feminine aspect of the divine is more predominant on the Friday night of Shabbat, right? The Sabbath Queen. Sabbath Queen was always one of those things growing up. I was wondering, like, who is this person, right? Like, we sing all these songs and it's the bride and it's the queen. It was like, I don't know. I didn't learn about the Shekhinah, the divine feminine, in Hebrew school, at my conservative Hebrew school in Tampa, Florida. And I was just, well, who are we singing to here? And people would say these things like the Sabbath Queen, as if that was self-evident, but it's definitely not self-evident, right? I mean, that's actually a really powerful invocation of the divine feminine. But then that changes in the day, and it's more the masculine aspects of the divine that are predominant. So like the parts of God that are more predominant at different times, the gender actually shifts. There's also the Sefirah of Yesod, which is kind of this conduit between all of the others, and the Shekhinah changes gender depending on its relationship to the other. So it's masculine as related to the Shekhinah, to the divine feminine, but it's feminine in relationship to all of the other Sefirot that it kind of gathers together. So I know this can seem very abstract, and we'll get a little concrete in just a moment, but the projection of what I would call radical gender play onto the divine is one of the most remarkable aspects, I think, of the Kabbalah. I wrote a scholarly article called Kabbalah and Queer Theology, which you can get. Get online. I think it's available online, and it goes on to this in a lot more detail. But as above, so below. This is this concept of the Kabbalah as male people doing avodah, doing service of the divine. Men are instructed to sometimes take the masculine role toward God and sometimes take the feminine role toward God, depending on which gender God is in that particular moment. And that too is pretty remarkable. The highest aspect of the soul, the neshama, is seen as feminine, and even the word Kabbalah, it means receiving, that in a sort of essentialistic way is also gendered feminine. And the whole purpose of Kabbalah for these practitioners is to be able to be in a receptive mode toward the divine, which again is associated in that system with the feminine. So that's kind of just right at the heart of the Jewish mystical and esoteric tradition, which goes back 800 years, is once again, like the biblical material, it's limited by this gender binary and by its essentialism, but it's quite remarkable in terms of its ability to see that gender and sex are not necessarily the same and often have to change back and forth. Okay, let's now look at two. We'll definitely have time for one of these, maybe for two, strange Kabbalistic texts. So this first one is number C there, Tikkunei Zohar, which is kind of a text appended to the Zohar. And I think, so I'm gonna read it, and it might seem even offensive, but speaking as the gay person, I want to reclaim it as actually liberating. So my question for you as you hear this text or read it is, why might I think this is a positive? Like, why do I love this text instead of hate it? Okay. So the text says, many scepters and sparks shoot out from Satan, from the side of evil, and hurl themselves onto the sons of man, which is human being. These are the souls of sinners when they mount bodies. Some of these souls are men and some are women. Sometimes female souls mount men, and sometimes male souls mount women. Woe to the drops, that's the drops of semen. Woe to the drops in which these sparks and scepters are intermingled. Fools who did not take precautions during sex made these horrors. Those who turn the table over cause these inversions. Anyone know what turn the table over means in Talmudic and Kabbalistic sex talk? It's literally in sexual intercourse having the woman on top of the man. Now you know, turn over the table. When the feminine is stronger than the masculine, at reincarnation, the next incarnation of the soul, he will not have a beard, will be infertile, and his actions will be animal-like, and he will be a toeva, right? That's a signal to homosexuality. When a female soul transmigrates into a man and mounts him, he will act like a woman. When he speaks, he will flutter his hands, and his voice and speech and all his behavior will be like those of a woman. So why do I love this text? Isn't this horrible? Is this text totally disgusting? But why do I think it's great? You can just unmute if you want to speak.
Well, first of all, it talks only about the male reincarnating,
right,
and not what will happen to the woman.
Right. Yeah, that is true. It is that way in the original. It is unfortunate for that respect. Yep. That's a good reason not to like it. That it's centering the male, a certain kind of male experience. But why might I still like this text? What's good about this text? Good. I don't know. Fascinating about it.
Well, it speaks to a transformation.
Mm.
So the feminine will be stronger than the masculine. The reincarnation will not have a beard. He'll be infertile. So it's almost like a transitioning or a transformation.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, thanks. Yep. Okay. One more maybe?
These things are not fixed. That one can change from one sex to another.
Yep. No, that's right. I think there's a sort of fluidity that's here. So I love this text for a lot of reasons, including those ones that were just named. First, I love this text just for visibility, right? This is a 13th century text talking about a sort of mincing, campy stereotype of what we would now see as a gay man, right? He will flutter his hands, and his voice and speech and all his behavior will be like that of a woman. So there's a part of that that's a sort of nasty stereotype, but there's also a part that is reflective of a certain way of being, right, in the world. And I love that. I can't think of any other 13th century text in which a kind of Harvey Fierstein-y sort of, mincing homosexual man is present, right? And I love that, right? I love that there's that visibility that there was, because this was written presumably because this person existed in the world, right? I don't think the author of the Tikkunei Zohar just sat in a room and thought up this character or caricature, right? I think this person is out in the world in some way and is generally omitted and obliterated from history. But here in this, pretty important Jewish mystical text, there they are, right? I love too that I don't actually know what pronouns to use for this person, right? So this person is somebody who has a male anatomy, right? But a female soul, right? Here, this is valenced clearly negatively, right? Having a soul that is a different gender from like your body, you're assigned male at birth, to use the conventional language today, right? So in this text, you're anatomically male, but you have a female soul, and this leads you to have certain female characteristics. And that, I think, is really, there's something, so like, who is this person, right? So today we might see this person, again, there's a lot of binary stuff we probably wouldn't use today. But maybe we would actually see this person as a transgender woman, right? This person is, they didn't have a concept, like they didn't have any modern medicine. So they certainly didn't have transgender medicine. It's always funny, by the way. It's like people are like, well, they didn't have gender transition in the 19th or 18th century. It's like, yeah, I mean, they also didn't have like medicine for heart disease. Like there's a lot of medicine that we're very fortunate to have in our day and age that wasn't there. So, right, they wouldn't have a concept of that, but this is a person with a female soul. And for me, if that's the sort of the root of the personality, that seems really profound, that there's somebody in here, right? Oh, and I saw in the chat, sorry, I had the chat closed for a while. Right. Okay, that's great. What Gadiel, if I'm pronouncing that right, said that there's this this range of gender nonconformity. So, and I think that's really, that for me is incredibly kind of inspiring. So the fluidity, the fact that, so, gender here is a sign there's something gendery about the soul. Obviously, again, I don't want to just pretend that this is all good, right? These are scepters coming out from Satan, right? So it's not like, isn't it great that people are, gender nonconforming? But nonetheless, it's actually there. So the wildest text takes this. This now is 300 years later. Rabbi Chaim Vital, or sorry, actually, you know what? I'm going to skip the Chaim Vital one. I'm going to go to the Yosef Karo one. Yosef Karo is skipping forward, a few hundred years. Also, one of the most important rabbis in normative Judaism, kind of compiled the Beit Yosef, which became the Shulchan Aruch, the codification of halacha, of Jewish law, and also a mystic who had a magid, which was kind of an angelic being that he spoke to. He was a medium. He was a channeler. And he recorded what the Magid told him in this book, the Magid Misharim. And so here, the same the same phenomenon, it appears, but it's valenced positive. Sasha, somehow you're able to like draw on the text, so I don't know if you can erase that, but I don't know how you have the magic power of annotating the text, but anyway, if it's possible to take that off, that would be great.
I don't know either, and I don't see the line anymore on my chat, so I don't know why you still see it.
Well, you've made your mark.
Sorry.
Okay. That's all right. So Yosef Karo starts this conversation with the Magid with a problem, with a phenomenon, and his problem is that he and his wife are unable to have children. And he asks the Magid why this is. And obviously, in this period, now we're in the 16th century, this was a profound crisis for Yosef Karo and his wife. And the Magid answers the following. In a previous incarnation, right, because the Kabbalah, transmigration of souls, your wife was a man who was stingy with his money and didn't give tzedakah, and who was stingy with his wisdom and didn't want to teach other. And so he was punished to be reincarnated as a woman, measure for measure. So what does this mean, aside from being reincarnated as a woman as a punishment, which is horrible? So the giving, the part that wants to give, actually, he'll explain it in his words. He didn't want to disseminate lashpia to others, but a tzaddik is supposed to disseminate to others, to be the foundation of the world. This means to be a man, because the yesod, this is the phallus, is what enables him to do the sexual activities of the man. But so in a previous incarnation, I'll summarize this bizarre teaching. Yosef Karo's wife was a man who didn't act like a man, right? The man is supposed to give, the man is supposed to teach, the man is supposed to literally inseminate and disseminate. But your wife didn't do that. But I will try, the Magid says, the angel says, to have sparks from a female soul. I didn't know what word to use here, so I made one up, insparked in her. In other words, so in paragraph 1, it's about to get even weirder. Yosef Karo has an explanation that sometimes we may be gender nonconforming because of something in a previous life, right? So here in life 1, this soul was a man who didn't act like a man. And so now it was reincarnated as a woman because it was acting like a woman in the previous life. But that's not the end of the story, because actually she can sort of change the gender of her soul because of this sort of angelic intervention. Okay, but it gets even kind of neater. So he continues, he says, her soul was a masculine soul, Yosef Karo's wife, because she was Tamar, who had a masculine soul. So what's the masculine who's Tamar and why does she have a masculine soul? So Tamar was the child, right? Who this was the whole story with Judah, and she was widowed, and she tricked, right? Exactly. So Gadiel just said, she is the child of Israel, of Jacob, who sorry, of Yehudah, who her husband doesn't fulfill the mitzvah of Puravu, and dies. The husband's brother refuses, Onan refuses to sort of uphold levirate marriage, and she takes the initiative to kind of, and in this, with an incestuous union, produce the children who would later be the line of David. So that's kind of, so right, she has a sort of, Tamar has a masculine soul. So now it's not just Yosef Karo's wife who has this soul, a masculine soul, it's also a biblical hero, Tamar. So he continues, one could ask, why does the kingdom of David, which is the kingdom of the Messiah, come by means of this matter that it's shameful to speak of publicly? In other words, incest between Tamar and her father-in-law. The great secret of Malchut is that it goes out from there, meaning Malchut is the daughter of Bina. We'll ignore that stuff. It's the Sfirot stuff. The soul of Tamar was masculine, and she was the daughter of Sham, which is a word for Bina, one of the feminine souls. And the soul of Judah was also the soul of Sham, and Malchut came out from it secretly. So it was two masculine souls, right, that were able to create the line of the Messiah. And so you would say, now, how could Tamar, the masculine soul, right? So Tamar, female character, has a masculine soul. But what about Judah? Judah's soul came from the sparks of a female soul. So she was able to give birth from him, even though it was turning the table. So now turning the table doesn't mean sexual position. It means that there's a woman with a masculine soul and a man with a feminine soul, but the feminine soul also is masculine, which is complicated. And so there was no fear that the offspring wouldn't be kings. So what is the takeaway from this crazy text, which you could look at more when we have more time? So now what Yosef Karo is doing is linking this phenomenon that the gender of a soul may be different from the gender of the body, first to his own wife, and then to explain the scandalous passage in the Bible where having this, I would call it cross-gendered, because I don't really want to say the word transgender, but this non-matching gender to sex thing is part of not just the divine plan, but what enables the Messiah to come into the world. So that's an upgrade, right? Instead of this being what it was in the earlier text, like an unfortunate or terrible accident, and instead of it even just being like punishment as it is in the first part of this text, actually there's some divine revelation in gender diversity, in the fact that some people's genders don't really match what we might expect from somebody with a male or a female sex. So I find this text really fascinating. It's obscure. It's not like the story of Jacob and Esau, but it's one of the many ways, and one day I'll have a book on all of these in one place. I'm going to stop sharing in just a moment. It's one of the ways in which these traditional Jewish texts wrestle with, again, I think somebody said in the chat, right, Sasha said, right, this is discussed as something that actually occurs, right? There's a phenomenon that's known over the centuries in the biblical period, in the medieval period, in the early modern period. There's a phenomenon that's being discussed that reflects a human phenomenon. And just like I loved that text with the fluttering, mincing gay caricature, I love these texts because there's a kind of implicit visibility that's there, right? The erasure of these lives from so many texts and histories, right, leads to this misconception that like, well, now why are there suddenly so many people? Like, we didn't have any of these people ever before in history. But gender diversity was always with us, right? It just has to be kind of excavated in a way that I think can be profoundly liberating. And for me, it's also Jewishly inspiring. So I will pause here for comments and questions, which don't have to be about what we just did. If you have a question relatedly, not about the fight on the floor of the Senate, but about almost anything else I said, I'm happy to jump in on that. Or I'll just drink my tea. You know, I teach meditation too, so I'm happy with silence.
Hi there. Wait, does anyone else speaking?
Nope, you're on.
Okay, great. Hi. This is great. I unfortunately missed part of it because I was cooking for Shabbat and lost track of time. But really appreciate this. So I've been really influenced or thinking a lot recently about Rebecca Epstein-Levy's recent book on Jewish sexual ethics, and one of the theses there is basically about like trying to read when we're thinking about a topic of sort of contemporary relevance of trying to look at a variety of texts, some of which might not be about what appears to be the same subject matter. And so, for example, like looking at discourses about ritual purity as related to STIs or something. So that's one of the examples. So I'm curious how you think about approaching texts which are not about maybe queer issues or gender or something like that. I mean, are there texts that sort of particularly speak to you? And I'm sorry if I missed some of this, but are there texts that particularly speak to you that don't like appear to be about gender issues or something like that sort of you feel like they capture something about gender? And I'm not trying to put you on the spot or anything, but would love to hear a bit about sort of how you approach texts that aren't specifically about gender issues.
Yeah, I love that. I love that hermeneutical approach to text first. Like, what does this have to do with this thing? Well, so for me, anytime where there's like this fundamental mismatch, right, between role and identity, right? So where I see like the story of Moses, for example, right? So Moses is just this fascinating figure on so many levels, right? I mean, what is his identity? It's not even really clear from the text. Like he's got multiple origin stories, and he's like this stranger in his own family, and then he's discovered, and like there's something really appealingly queer to me about that. There's also something really interesting to me where there are other figures who again seem to, this is more a little closer to gender, but still, where there are figures like Miriam or Hannah who invent different modes of prayer. So there's like a kind of, here's what prayer looks like, and here are these women who are saying, actually, what if it's this other thing? Especially the story with Shmuel's mother Hannah, like, Eli the priest comes off as kind of a loser. He's like, what are you, drunk? She's like, no, I'm inventing Jewish prayer. And 2,000 years from now, everyone's going to pray this way, and no one's going to pray your way. She doesn't say that, but I wish she would. And right, so like, is that about gender? To me, it sort of is. It's also a kind of a queerness, that's there. But I love that general approach, right? Because it also like can tease out one of the places that does this. There's a book by a Christian scholar named Ken Stone called Practicing Safer Texts. And he is, first of all, a great title. He's very interested in the ways in which boundaries are drawn, and some of the boundaries around Canaanite, Israelite, which seem to be have not been. They were not ethnic boundaries. They weren't even familial boundaries. They were like identities of affiliation. You would have people, just like now, you might have people in your family who are like religious or not religious, or this person converted to that or whatever. That was true in ancient Israel as well. And this construction of this boundary, like we are a people different from all of the other people, that was a rhetorical construction. That was a social construction. And Ken in that book does a lot to connect like some of the laws around purity, which you mentioned actually, to the ways in which this sort of, I wouldn't call it fake. Like a social construction is a social construction, right? I mean, when you see a traffic light and it's got a red and a yellow and a green light, that's not fake, right? It's like, it's not essential. It doesn't mean that green always means go. But for everyone on this Zoom, I'm sure green means go and red means stop, right? Like that to me is very gendery, right? We've sort of agreed that there is this like association, but it's socially constructed. We could have a different construction of what that gender is, or what the red and the yellow and the green, like it doesn't, I don't want to push that analogy too far. My point is just that it's a social construction, and that doesn't mean that it's fake. It just means it's a social construction. And so seeing other social constructions of boundary and transgressions of that boundary, where it's like, oh, it's actually not either red or yellow, or like there's not everybody fits in one of these three color categories. That to me, anytime there's that, I think there's an echo. Yeah. But thanks for bringing that in, because I think that's a really productive way to read as well. And another good example of that is Mary Douglas's masterpiece, kind of a classic, Purity and Danger. And her other book, Leviticus's Literature, which analogizes the ordering that the sky god does in Genesis with the ordering that the Israelites do in creating the Mizbeach, the tabernacle. And taking these two seemingly disparate parts of the Bible, but really suggesting, or the Torah, and suggesting that there's actually a close connection.
Fascinating. Lots to chew on. Thank you.
Thanks. We might have time for one or maybe two more. Yeah, there's kind of, back on that social construction thing, it's sort of, it can feel for folks sometimes like, social constructions are very real, like in our lived experience, because we live within them. And so when there is a misfit or a mismatch between social expectations, which are constructed, but which are so powerful, and one's own lived experience, it's not like there has to be an essentialism, like I am essentially this, X is 1 and Y is 2. It's just that there's that profound mismatch between the constructed norm and one's lived experience. That's like that mismatch that is profound. Yes, Joanne, thank you for finding the hand raise function.
It's actually Rob, Joanne's husband, who's got this question.
We're together.
I was really struck by the Joseph Caro passage, because the insight that he is conveying is coming from this entity that he is channeling. And that sort of puts it in an entirely different category, or maybe it doesn't, but how do you read that?
Yeah, I am also fascinated by that. First of all, there's like only a little bit of scholarship on, like what he is presenting this as. Like, we have this conception of channeling, but that's sort of our word. Like, is there really like an angelic, like a light being, behind me on the bookshelf? And it's kind of, so it's open. For me, I think it's like, this is a source of revelation. Right. And Elijah the prophet often functions in this way in the Zohar and elsewhere in mystical literature. Right. And it's kind of audacious if you think about it. It's like, on the one hand, it's funny to analogize it, to contemporary stuff. Well, I spoke to the Holy Spirit and, the Holy Spirit told me X or Y or Z. It's like, well, that's hard to argue with. and sometimes it's very problematic, right? What they say the Holy Spirit is. But here it's this audacious claim that, like, well, I have this angelic guide and that's how I know it's true. And it's also, what we have is only the text. Who knows, maybe it was just a literary device, right? And he was just, there are sources which talk about Joseph Caro which suggest that he did have this experience, that it's not just a literary device. Of course, we don't really know that, but it's really I think it's a profoundly audacious claim to kind of be like, yeah, you're busy stigmatizing my wife or me for our inability to have children. Well, actually, guess what? I found out this divine revelation that she has a masculine soul. That's why she's not having children. And not only that, but having a masculine soul in a female identified body has this long lineage, which includes Tamar, which includes being the ancestor of the Messiah. I was thinking about claiming that later, but yeah, that's quite remarkable, I think. All right, I think we are at time, which I love to respect time. If there's something urgent, I see Jennifer's wonderful. Yep, I love that. I'll let you have that last word in the chat. I think it's a really lovely sentiment. And I'll just, I'll finish by, again, for me, and this happened with me in God versus Gay, there can be a way in which some of this conversation can sound like apologetics, like it's okay to be trans because Jace found this thing about Jacob. And that's not my concept at all. It's rather, enriching our experience of present moment experiences of gender that we have in our community, and being like, oh, well, actually, here's a way in which these fundamental texts and traditions that are part of our tradition also had similar encounters with the gender spectrum, and had all these different ways of understanding it. Not that it has to be understood in this way. Like, it's not like saying it's okay because Joseph Caro wrote this book 400 years ago that says that there's this thing, but rather it's the finding of ourselves and the richnesses of our experience and our community's experience in the past. For me, makes this much less of, it just makes it a richer exploration, that this is not just like a recent phenomenon, that this is part of the human condition, and here are the ways in which sacred text, some of the ways in which sacred text has interacted with it. So it's been a pleasure to share these with you this evening. You remuted yourself, Shoshana.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate your talk. And I think that we'll all be looking at texts in a slightly different way going forward. So my guess is that you've stimulated a lot of interesting conversations. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
the really poignant questions and comments and stuff.
Thank
All right,
you.
be well.
Great. Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
Thanks.
Thank you.